discuss the significance of that moment and the Pope's letter on climate change, Dr. Paul Collins joins us in our Canberra studio. He's a former Catholic priest and the author of a book on religion and ecology called Judgment Day, The Struggle for Life on Earth. And in Sydney, we're joined by the Executive Director of the Sydney Institute, Gerard Henderson, with a particular interest in the history of the Catholic Church in Australia, and his biography of B.A. Santa Maria will be published in August. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
And Paul Collins, first to you. Has Pope Francis just redefined the global debate on climate change?
I'm not too certain about that, Tony. I suspect what he's trying to do is to begin a dialogue about climate change. I pretty much agree with what Archbishop Hart had to say. What I think we need to do is get people talking honestly and looking at the bigger picture. That's the other thing. I mean, it's easy to focus just on what he says about climate change, and he certainly doesn't give any comfort to skeptics, but at the same time, he places that, as Archbishop Hart said in a 103-page document, he places it in a much wider perspective, in the perspective of the relationship between ecology and social justice. He highlights the issue of the loss of biodiversity. So just to focus on climate change, in some ways, I think, is a bit myopic. It's a much broader letter than that.
No, it's true. Gerard Henderson, what do you think? How significant is this encyclical?
Well, I think the introduction sets it up a bit. It's like all these encyclicals, they're pretty dull documents. I mean, I've read it. It's hard work. It's not particularly exciting. But I think the important point is we've got to understand what an encyclical is. This is the teaching authority of the Church. The Pope does not claim to be infallible. No Pope has since 1950, which is a long time ago. But if you look at section 188, the Pope says the Church does not presume to settle scientific questions. So in section 188, he's basically saying, look, this is what we think, but we're not trying to determine scientific questions. And to some extent, it's a bit all over the place. I mean, you've got stuff about climate change, you've got catastrophe stuff, you've got a call to bring back grace before and after meals and to go to Mass on Sunday. I mean, I tell you one thing, if this was an encyclical on same-sex marriage, you wouldn't be having this discussion here in Lateline tonight. I mean, it's interesting because it's the Pope.
Well, it depends if some of the statements were as absolutely clear as some of the individual statements, for example, about climate change, suggest that global warming threatens the planet. Yeah, but that's a pretty serious statement from a Pope, and that action which has been very slow until now, must proceed at a much faster clip.
This is like all these social documents going back to Rerum Novarum in 1890. These are vague propositions. There's hardly a name cited, apart from St. Francis, and St. Therese got in there, which is great for gender balance. She got in there, but there's hardly a name cited. There's hardly a place cited. There's hardly a fact cited. There's not a scientist quoted. It's how the group in the Vatican who sort of work on encyclicals, and there's a kind of encyclical writing group, they've got to write something, so this is what they're writing, and it positions the Church in a very fashionable position. They're in there sort of with all the sort of left liberal, socially concerned people in Western Europe and North America, and that's where they probably want to be. I don't think this encyclical would do any harm, but it's not quite as it's presented, I think.
Well, some very senior American politicians have taken a very different view. They seem to think it's the Pope has overstepped the mark. He's moving into politics. He should stick with morality and theology. That's what Santorum and Bush have both said.
Well, if you're an Australian, it's not good news. I mean, the Pope seems to think we should get rid of coal. We should downplay gas. I mean, this is not. I mean, and he thinks that our standard of living should decline. This is actually written that that some people, presumably people in Western Europe and Australia and North America, should have a declining standards of living.
So, do you think? Do you suspect on that basis that senior Catholics within the cabinet will simply ignore it, or will they have to respond to it because the Pope is their ultimate religious leader?
The Pope has never instructed Catholics in this country or any other country what to do on politics or economics. It never has. He only ever does on
contraception, homosexuality,
on artificial contraception, and there is a teaching body of the Church, but many Catholics don't follow that anyway.
Okay, let's go to Paul Collins on this, because it seems that what the Pope is actually doing here is shifting the whole idea of morality so that sin actually does include sin against the environment. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely, without any doubt at all, Tony. And I mean, in a way, Gerard it is trivializing it. The Pope addresses a whole range of absolutely central issues for the contemporary world. We've already outlined some of them: global warming, biodiversity loss, the use of fossil fuels, all of those things. But the encyclical is much bigger than that. I can see that parts of it are boring. I've read it right through as well. But there are parts of it that are actually quite poetic. So what the Pope is trying to get at here is that sin is not just about what individuals do. Sin is also about what communities and institutions do.
Well, he said, but as Gerard said, he does seem to be pointing the finger at industry as well and suggesting it's raped and pillaged the land.
Well, I think there's some evidence that that has happened. I mean, it's not as though industry has been perfect and behaved admirably everywhere. You know, one only has to think of an example like the Fly River in Papua New Guinea that was destroyed by, we won't name it, but by an Australian company, and is now, that company is trying to remediate the damage they did.
Okay, so Paul, do you think there's a political message here as the key point?
Without a doubt, there is a political message here.
What is it?
The political message simply is that we can't go on as we are. We have to confront the destructive and exploitative behaviour that has characterised Western industrialism. We also have to tackle the issue of the exclusion of people, people who have no equity in their lives, people who are struggling with poverty and with even putting a meal on their plate, and their countries are the ones that are being exploited.
Okay, all right. Let's go to Gerard. He wants to respond to that.
I mean, if you're going to decrease the living standards of people who are trying to get out of poverty in China and India, I don't think this is a very smart way to do it. And the idea, since these countries are very important to the whole issue of climate change, presumably, if the theory is correct, the idea that the leadership in Beijing and New Delhi is going to say, oh my God, we're in trouble. Dr. Collins thinks that what we're doing is sinful. I mean,
it's more like what Pope Francis says.
Well,
that
Pope Francis thinks we're sinful. I mean, what do you think the Hindu leadership in India is going to say? Oh my God, you know, we've got to change our policy on this. Let's keep millions of Indians, hundreds of millions of Indians without electricity because the Pope thinks we might be sinning.
Gerard, Cardinal Pell, as we know, went on the record in 2010, as I said earlier, decrying scientific consensus on climate change and describing the climate movement as totalitarian and so on and so forth, and actually arguing against putting any cost on pollution. So I'm just wondering if he's actually been trumped by Pope Francis here, and if his influence in the Vatican is less than we imagine.
Well, Cardinal Pell, as I understand, has been brought to the Vatican to clean up the mess. I mean, the Vatican's giving lectures to the rest of the world. It can't run its own state. It can't run its own economy. So Cardinal Pell's been brought in as number 3 from Australia with some of his advisors to clean up the economic mess, and that's what he'll do.
Clearly they weren't listening to him on this subject, that's the point.
Well, they probably weren't, but then, you know, I don't think it's going to affect his position at the Vatican because, as I said, if you look at Section 188, the Vatican is saying that they're not going to set scientific policy, and nor should they. If you look at their background, you know, it doesn't really qualify them to set scientific policy, and they're not going to do it. But this will be picked up, and people will say Pope Francis is saying the right thing, and there are some nice things in the encyclical, and we can all hold hands and feel good about it on Sunday. Right. Those of us who go to church on Sunday.
We're nearly out of time, Joe. I have to go back to Paul Collins. Is this the most radical Pope we've seen?
Certainly, for quite some time, I would think that Pope John the 23rd was pretty radical as well. But what I think we've got with Francis is a man who's coming from a different world. He's not coming from the European world. He doesn't have the kind of backgrounds that all his predecessors have had. So he's coming with a knowledge and an experience of poverty, of social exclusion. He's coming from a country that's certainly economically not behaved particularly well. So he's coming with a very different vision, and I think that this encyclical reflects that vision.
Okay, just quickly a final comment from Gerard. Is he a radical Pope, and is he Catholic in the true tradition of Catholicism?
Well, he's a Jesuit, so I guess he has to be. Look, he's always been concerned with social justice, but so has the Church going back a century. So he's in that tradition. I don't think he's as radical as a lot of his fans think he is. I don't think he's very radical on moral issues. We will find out in time. I'd be surprised if he is. But look, he's been a breath of fresh air, and he's changed the setup in the Vatican, and he lives a relatively humble life, and I think the fact he brought Cardinal Pell over was a good decision. So I think he's a breath of fresh air, but I mean, the Vatican's not going to suddenly drop centuries of teaching just to be popular. It's never worked that way in the past. I doubt that it will in the future.
Gerard Henderson, Paul Collins, I have to leave you both there. Thank you very much for joining us
A
tonight.
pleasure.
Thank you, Tony.
Pleasure.